The girl who entered the palace. She was just 14. A girl barely grown, with smooth hands that had never held a sword and eyes that had not yet seen the cruelty of the world. Her name was Wu Zhao. When she stepped through the great gates of the Tang Imperial Palace, she did not come as a princess, nor as a noble daughter. She came as a low-ranking concubine, one of many, nameless among a sea of silks and smiles. The palace was vast, overwhelming, a place where beauty meant nothing without favor, and favor meant nothing without power. Every hallway echoed with the soft rustle of robes and the whispers of rivalry. Some women fought with words, some with charm, some simply faded away. Wu Zhao said very little. She watched. She listened. She remembered who smiled too quickly, who bowed too deeply, who stood too long outside the emperor's chamber doors. In the mornings, she stood in line with the others, hoping her name would be called. In the evenings, she knelt in silence, folding her hands just right, lowering her gaze just enough to appear obedient, but never weak. At night, beneath thin curtains and dim candlelight, she stared at the ceiling. She didn't cry. She didn't dream of home. She thought of the emperor, of his eyes, his voice, his power. The world said she was property now, a girl to be seen and forgotten. But Wu Zhao was not a girl who forgot. She memorized the layout of the palace, the names of the guards, the schedule of the servants. She watched the movements of the Empress, the noble wives, the ones who carried influence in their silence. She understood something most others didn't, that the palace was a game, and every player who survived long enough could change the rules. At 14, she had no allies, no family near, no power, but she had patience. And patience, she knew, was more powerful than beauty. She had come into the palace through the servants' gate, but she didn't plan to leave that way. Somewhere, deep inside, beneath the silence, a flame had been lit, and it would not go out. The silent years in the temple. When Emperor Taizong passed away, the palace changed. The grand halls grew quieter. The women who once served him were no longer needed. And by tradition, those without royal children were sent away, not back to their families, but to temples, where they would live out the rest of their days, in silence. Wu Zhao, still just a teenager, was among them. She was taken to a Buddhist convent, a cold gray place far from the gold and red of the imperial court. There, she was given a new name, plain robes, and a life stripped of luxury. Each morning she rose before the sun to sweep stone floors, light incense, and bow before silent statues. She ate simple meals and slept on a hard mat. No jewelry, no music, no voices calling her name. In the eyes of the empire, she no longer existed. But Wu Zhao did not fade. In fact, she watched everything more closely than ever. She listened to the whispers of visiting nobles' wives, to the temple girls chattering about rumors from the palace. She paid attention to the monks, to the weathered scholars who came to light incense and spoke of unrest, of shifting tides in the capital. While others bowed their heads in prayer, she studied. While others forgot the court, she remembered. And when night fell and the temple grew still, she would lie on her mat, eyes open in the dark, thinking not of freedom, but of return. She remembered the emperor's court, the rules, the power, the game. She had walked among it once, even if only briefly. She had seen the throne, and now, even in exile, she couldn't forget it. The silence around her became her training. The routine became her discipline. While others aged and faded within the temple walls, Wu Zhao sharpened her mind like a blade, waiting for something, anything, to change. Then one day, change came. A royal visitor arrived at the convent. He was tall, young, dressed in robes embroidered with dragons. It was Emperor Gaozong, son of the late Emperor Taizong, the same boy who had once looked at her with quiet admiration in the palace now stood before her as ruler of the Tang dynasty. He had not forgotten Wu Zhao, her beauty, her sharpness, her presence, and despite all tradition, despite all custom, he summoned her back. The other women whispered in shock. No one had ever returned to the palace after entering a temple, but Wu Zhao was no ordinary woman. She accepted the emperor's call without hesitation, stepped back into the halls she once walked as a child, now older, wiser, and far more dangerous, and so she returned, not as a girl waiting to be chosen, but as a woman ready to shape her fate. What the world saw as scandal, she saw as destiny. She had been thrown into silence. Now she had found her voice. This time, she would not fade. This time, she would not wait. This time, she had come to stay. The silent years in the temple. When Emperor Taizong passed away, the palace changed. The grand halls grew quieter. The women who once served him were no longer needed, and by tradition, those without royal children were sent away, not back to their families, but to temples, where they would live out the rest of their days in silence. Wu Zhao, still just a teenager, was among them. She was taken to a Buddhist convent, a cold, gray place far from the gold and red of the imperial court. There she was given a new name, plain robes, and a life stripped of luxury. Each morning she rose before the sun to sweep stone floors, light incense, and bow before silent statues. She ate simple meals and slept on a hard mat. No jewelry, no music, no voices calling her name. In the eyes of the empire, she no longer existed. But Wu Zhao did not fade. In fact, she watched everything more closely than ever. She listened to the whispers of visiting nobles' wives, to the temple girls chattering about rumors from the palace. She paid attention to the monks, to the weathered scholars who came to light incense and spoke of unrest, of shifting tides in the capital. While others bowed their heads in prayer, she studied. While others forgot the court, she remembered. And when night fell and the temple grew still, she would lie on her mat, eyes open in the dark, thinking not of freedom, but of return. She remembered the emperor's court, the rules, the power, the game. She had walked among it once, even if only briefly. She had seen the throne, and now, even in exile, she couldn't forget it. The silence around her became her training. The routine became her discipline. While others aged and faded within the temple walls, Wu Zhao sharpened her mind like a blade, waiting for something, anything, to change. Then one day, change came. A royal visitor arrived at the convent. He was tall, young, dressed in robes embroidered with dragons. It was Emperor Gaozong, son of the late Emperor Taizong. The same boy who had once looked at her with quiet admiration in the palace now stood before her as ruler of the Tang dynasty. He had not forgotten Wu Zhao, her beauty, her sharpness, her presence, and despite all tradition, despite all custom, he summoned her back. The other women whispered in shock. No one had ever returned to the palace after entering a temple, but Wu Zhao was no ordinary woman. She accepted the emperor's call without hesitation, stepped back into the halls she once walked as a child, now older, wiser, and far more dangerous, and so she returned, not as a girl waiting to be chosen, but as a woman ready to shape her fate. What the world saw as scandal, she saw as destiny. She had been thrown into silence. Now she had found her voice. This time, she would not fade. This time, she would not wait. This time, she had come to stay. The Empress and the Cradle. The court had learned to whisper her name, but not yet to fear it. Wu Zhao, though favored by the emperor, still moved quietly in the shadows of the palace. She had not spoken against the Empress. She had not demanded status. But every gesture she made, every word she spoke to the emperor, was a thread quietly woven into a larger design. She understood patience, and she understood timing. The palace was full of eyes, but most of them looked in the wrong direction. And so when tragedy struck, no one saw it coming. The emperor and Wu Zhao had a daughter, a child born in softness and celebration, swaddled in silk and hope. The emperor adored her. For a brief moment it seemed Wu Zhao's place in the court had become untouchable. But then, one morning, everything changed. The child was found lifeless in her cradle. The nursemaid screamed. Servants came running. Guards rushed to the quarters. The Empress, upon hearing the news, arrived quickly, her face pale, her hands clenched. What happened next remains uncertain in the official records. There was no formal investigation, no trial. But soon, the Emperor was told a terrible story. That the Empress, driven by jealousy, had entered the chambers alone the night before, and that no one else had been near the child until morning. It was a claim that shook the court. The Empress denied it. She wept. She begged. But the Emperor, devastated and furious, believed the worst. Whether out of grief or influence, he ordered her removed, stripped of rank, sent away in disgrace, and in her place, Wu Zhao rose. No one spoke the word murder. No one accused Wu Zhao of anything. But behind the fans, behind the robes, the whispers began. Could she have? Would she? Those who dared to ask the question never asked it twice. Because one truth stood above all others. The Empress was gone, and Wu Zhao now sat where she once had. Whether it was fate, misfortune, or something darker, only she knew. But she said nothing. She mourned her daughter with a still face. She accepted her new title with quiet humility. And so, without raising her voice, without pointing a finger, she became Empress Wu. In a world of thunderous power struggles, hers was a rise carried on the silence between words, and the empire would never be the same again. The weight of the crown. To be crowned Empress was to stand at the emperor's side, to share his name, his hall, his throne. But for Wu Zhao, it was more than a title. It was a shift in the wind. She no longer walked behind others. She no longer bowed in waiting. Now the court bowed to her. The same noble families who once turned their eyes away when she passed were forced to greet her with full ceremony. Ministers who had whispered doubts now chose their words more carefully, because the woman they had underestimated had become something they did not fully understand. Emperor Gaozong, though sincere in heart, was often weakened by illness, sometimes too fatigued to rise from bed, too burdened by headaches to attend council meetings. And so, in those long stretches of weakness, someone had to hold the reins of the empire. That someone was Wu Zhao. She did not seize the task. She accepted it when offered. Quietly, respectfully. She sat beside the throne, at court sessions, reviewing petitions, advising the emperor, answering when his voice faltered. At first, the ministers thought it temporary, a convenience while the emperor recovered. But weeks passed, then months, and still she remained. She was careful, always. She never spoke too much, never issued orders directly. Everything she did bore the name of the emperor, even when the emperor was absent. Her power was like water, filling the spaces others left behind. She did not shout. She did not command. She simply did what needed to be done. And what she did with clarity. The empire noticed. Officials from distant provinces began to send letters addressed not just to the emperor, but to the Empress. Her name appeared more and more frequently in official documents. When laws were revised, it was said the Empress had suggested them. When disputes were settled, her judgment was praised, but not everyone was pleased. The court was filled with scholars and nobles who believed a woman's hand had no place in politics, that the inner palace and the outer court must remain divided. They spoke cautiously, but they spoke. Some accused her of overreach. Others hinted that she was too ambitious. Wu Zhao answered none of them. She let the emperor speak when he could, and when he could not, she let silence speak louder. One by one, her critics began to find themselves reassigned, sent to distant provinces, far from the capital. Others fell ill with suspicion, retiring early to avoid the danger of being too loud. New officials were promoted, many of them men of humble background, selected not by birth, but by skill. Men who owed their positions not to family ties, but to the Empress who had seen their worth. She was building something, slowly, deliberately, not just a government, but a foundation, not just influence, but a future. From her seat beside the throne, Wu Zhao was shaping the empire with a steady hand. And though the emperor still wore the crown, all of Chang'an could feel it. The empire was beginning to answer to someone else. The court. Behind the curtain. There are moments in history when power does not change hands with a sword, or a speech or a ceremony. Sometimes it moves in silence, passing from one set of fingers to another, without a single witness noticing until the weight of the world has already shifted. That was how Wu Zhao ruled. Not with force, not with titles, but with presence, with patience, with precision. By the time Emperor Gaozong's illnesses became more frequent, no one in the palace doubted who was truly holding the empire together. Wu Zhao no longer simply advised. She reviewed reports. She signed decrees. She met with ministers. When judgments were issued, they bore the imperial seal, but the voice behind them was hers. And she made sure that voice was measured, careful, and never careless. She did not sit upon the dragon throne, but she sat behind it, just beyond the curtain, where no woman had ever dared to rule. Ministers would enter the hall and see only the emperor's seal, but they knew, and more importantly, they obeyed. She changed things slowly. She strengthened the examination system that allowed men from poor families to become officials through learning. She elevated capable administrators. She promoted those who were loyal not to families, but to the state. She encouraged Buddhist leaders and scholars, building quiet support among the temples and those who saw her as a protector of order and merit. But not all were pleased. In the corridors of the palace, old families whispered of imbalance. Some said the Empress was overstepping. Others claimed she was charming the emperor with soft words while tightening her grip on the court. There were murmurs of defiance and, in some cases, resistance. But Wu Zhao did not strike quickly. She let doubt ferment, let their words float through the air like incense, easy to see, easy to trace. And then, when the time was right, she answered not with anger, but with action. Those who had questioned her were asked to retire or sent to remote posts where their voices would not carry. Those who defied her openly were replaced by younger men with no titles but sharper minds. Men who did not ask if a woman could rule, only whether the empire ran well under her hand. She built a network of loyalty not based on fear, but on function. The more she governed, the smoother things ran. Taxes were collected more efficiently. The provinces calmed. The border generals sent word that things were stable. The people saw no chaos, only peace. And that peace was hers. The emperor still sat at court when he was strong enough. But even he began to refer questions to his empress. He trusted her, respected her judgment. And slowly, even he began to believe what others had quietly accepted, that Wu Zhao was no longer merely an empress. She was, in many ways, the empire itself. She did not wear the crown, but she had become the mind behind it, the hands that held it, the will that sustained it. And though no one dared to speak the words aloud, deep inside the court, one truth echoed quietly through every corridor, behind every closed door, and within every bowed head, the one who ruled China now sat behind a curtain. The quiet war power never settles peacefully. Even when the empire is quiet, even when the people are fed, and the province is obedient, the court is never still. Behind every folded sleeve, behind every low bow, behind every polite smile, there are ambitions waiting for a crack in the wall. And now, the crack was a woman. There were many who had accepted Wu Zhao's place, not out of love, but out of fear or silence or resignation. But not all. In the shadows of the court, resistance began to stir. It did not rise with swords or banners, but with letters, petitions, rumors, whispers in tea rooms, side glances in court halls. Some claimed she had gone too far, that the Empress now ruled while the Emperor watched. Others spoke of ancient customs, of harmony between yin and yang, of balance upset by a woman reaching beyond her station. These voices rarely spoke aloud, but they reached the ears of Wu Zhao, as all things eventually did. And though she answered none of them publicly, she listened, carefully. The ministers who objected too loudly were called forward. Some were questioned, some were reassigned. A few were removed entirely, not by accusation, but by procedure, not by force, but by reason. Their records were reviewed, their judgments challenged. Their errors, however small, became their undoing. There was no chaos, no shouting, only the quiet removal of names from ledgers, the disappearance of titles from records, the folding of careers into silence. Others were more dangerous. Some who opposed her did so behind the shield of bloodline. They were sons of old families, clans with long histories, ties that stretched back to the founding of the Tang. They believed themselves untouchable. Wu Zhao disagreed. She moved with precision. She exposed corruption, mismanagement, favors, granted in secret. She held them accountable not for disloyalty, but for incompetence. And when they were removed, the empire did not tremble. It applauded. The people did not care for politics. They cared for stability. And as long as roads were safe, taxes fair, and food available, they asked few questions about who sat behind the curtain. Still, the whispers did not die. And so she built something stronger than reaction. She built a system. She expanded the use of secret reports, letters sent directly to the palace by officials in every province, bypassing the old bureaucracy. She created networks of informants, not to punish the innocent, but to see what was hidden. She watched the watchers, and she made sure no voice grew so loud that it could not be silenced. Some would call it control. Others would call it order. To Wu Zhao, it was survival. She knew she could not be loved by all, but she could be respected, and in time, obeyed. The emperor still appeared at court when his health allowed, but those in the room no longer looked to him when hard questions were asked. They waited, and when the curtain shifted, and the voice came from behind it, calm, steady, undeniable, they listened. And so the war continued, not with blood, but with appointments, not with swords, but with silence, not with armies, but with records and scrolls. It was not the kind of war sung about in poems, but it was the kind that changed history. Suns and shadows raising suns inside a palace is not like raising suns in the world outside. There are no quiet fields to run through, no village paths to wander, no warm laughter shared in open kitchens. There are only walls, tall and silent. There are only servants, guards, scrolls, and ceremony. A prince learns early that affection must be measured, that loyalty is often tested, that the woman who tucks you into bed at night may one day command armies, or decide who will wear the crown. Wu Zhao loved her children, but she loved them as a ruler. She taught them to read not just books, but faces. She spoke to them of duty before love, of destiny before desire. She did not dote, she did not spoil. She prepared, because she knew the world they would inherit was not gentle. Her sons grew up in her shadow. well-fed, well-dressed, but always under the weight of something unspoken. At court, they stood beside her, but their voices were soft. When they offered opinions, she listened, and then answered with decisions that left no room for challenge. They were princes, but she was empress, and everyone in the court understood that difference clearly. As they became men, some began to resist. One son, brave but reckless, spoke against her policies. He questioned her choices. He spoke too openly to the wrong people. Wu Zhao warned him once, then again. And when he did not learn, he was removed. Not with rage, not with punishment meant to destroy, but with quiet certainty. His title was revoked, his duties withdrawn. He was placed under house guard in a distant residence, far from the palace where his voice had once tried to rise. Another son tried a different path, more cautious, more quiet. He gathered supporters behind closed doors. He whispered of the future, of what might happen when the Empress's health began to fail. But Wu Zhao's ears were everywhere, and before his plans could take shape, he too was quietly erased from the line of succession. It was not a matter of cruelty. It was a matter of control. In her mind, the empire came first, above comfort, above custom, even above the natural pull of a mother's heart. Those around her said little. The ministers did not question her choices. The people outside the court knew only that the country was stable. But in the palace, among the halls where she once held her children in her arms, there were now only silences. Only one son remained near the throne, a boy who had grown into a man with careful words and lowered eyes. He did not question. He did not plan. He accepted his role as it was given. And for now, he remained safe. But safety, in a world shaped by power, was never permanent. And Wu Zhao knew this. She had built a dynasty from shadows, and even those she had once carried in, her arms, might someday become the ones she had to silence. It is a lonely thing to rule completely, and sometimes the deepest shadows come from within. The mandate of heaven. It had been years since Wu Zhao first stepped into the palace. Years since she had knelt behind the throne, speaking only when asked. Years since she had risen, slowly and deliberately, through the silence and the smoke. Now she stood at the edge of something no woman had ever touched in the history of China. Not beside the emperor, not behind him, but above the throne itself. Emperor Gaozong had long since passed. His memory was honored, his name recited in ceremonies. But in life, his power had already passed to her. And now, in death, his absence left a question that the court could no longer avoid. Who would truly rule? Her sons had failed to rise. Rivals had vanished in silence. Ministers bowed without hesitation. The people outside the palace knew only stability, grain in the markets, peace on the borders, and the temples, the voices of heaven, had begun to speak of her not as consort, not as regent, but as destined. Wu Zhao moved with great care. She did not rush. She did not demand. Instead, she allowed her supporters to speak for her. Buddhist monks came forward with prophecies, scrolls said to foretell the rise of a woman ruler who would bring order to the world. Scholars composed essays praising her wisdom, her justice, her divine alignment with heaven's will. The court was flooded with voices, many of them rehearsed, but all of them saying the same thing. The empire needed her, not as a mother of kings, but as sovereign. And so in the year 690, Wu Zhao did what no woman before her had dared. She accepted the mandate of heaven, the ancient and sacred permission said to come from the skies themselves, and declared the beginning of a new dynasty, the Zhou. The Tang name, revered for generations, was put aside, not erased, not destroyed, but paused. In its place rose something new, something hers. The ceremony was grand, but not boastful. She dressed not in the flowing silks of an empress, but in the robes of a ruler, strong, dark, deliberate. She ascended the steps of the imperial altar not as a guest, not as a widow, but as emperor. Not empress, not queen, not regent, emperor. Huangdi. A new character was created for her name, Zhao, combining the sun and the moon under the sky. It was a name that spoke of light, of balance, of presence in all things. It was more than a title. It was a declaration. The court bent their knees. The generals pledged loyalty. The provinces raised new banners. The scribes wrote a new date. And in the center of it all, Wu Zhao sat alone on the dragon throne, not as the wife of a ruler, but as ruler herself. There was no battle, no uprising, no bloodshed in the capital, only a quiet acceptance shaped by years of control, years of careful rule. The world did not explode. It simply changed. She was no longer walking in a man's shadow. She had become the sun. The reign begins. The dragon throne had never known a woman's weight. It had held warriors, scholars, rulers born of royal blood and trained since childhood. But now, for the first time, it held someone different. Someone who had not been born to rule, but had shaped herself into a ruler through quiet strength, endless observation, and unwavering resolve. Wu Zhao, now Emperor of China, began her reign not with fanfare, but with focus. She knew what the court expected. Some hoped she would simply preserve the peace and fade with age. Others believed she would rule as a figurehead, letting the old families behind her resume control. But she had not waited this long, watched this long, built this long, only to surrender the moment she held it all in her hands. Her rule began with changes, quiet at first, then unmistakable. She restructured the central bureaucracy, removing men who owed their positions to lineage, and replacing them with scholars who had risen through examination and talent. She opened the imperial exam system more widely, giving men from rural regions, men with no family name, but sharp minds, a path to rise. And many did. These men, grateful for her trust, became the backbone of her court. Loyal, efficient, and unafraid to serve a ruler who saw them as more than bloodlines. She knew that ruling required more than appointments. It required legitimacy. So she worked to secure it from every corner. She supported Buddhism openly, commissioning texts and temples, offering protection to monks who in turn spoke of her as a ruler chosen by fate. She built alliances not through fear, but through stability, giving the provinces peace, giving the generals clarity, giving the farmers safety to grow and harvest without worry. In court, her presence was commanding. She sat straight. She listened carefully. She rarely raised her voice, but when she spoke, her words were final. Ministers who had once served 3 emperors now bent their heads lower than ever before, not out of fear, but because they knew she understood the weight of their offices better than anyone. She did not erase the memory of the Tang. She honored it. She referenced it in edicts. She kept its scholars, its books, its history. But she made it clear, this was a new time. A time led not by the past, but by what was proven to work. And under her, things worked. Roads were repaired. Border defense was maintained. The treasury grew. The people, most of whom had never seen her face, knew only that the country was calm and the markets full. But peace is not the same as stillness. Wu Zhao knew that shadows still gathered in the corners, that some in the court still waited, watching her age, waiting for a mistake, a moment of weakness. So she did not slow down. She kept the court active, kept the provinces engaged, kept her vision one step ahead. She did not rule from fear. She ruled from movement, constant, deliberate, thoughtful movement. In her first years as emperor, Wu Zhao proved what few had believed possible, that a woman could sit on the throne of China not as a symbol but as a sovereign. And in doing so, she did not change the empire in a single moment. She changed it quietly, day by day, decision by decision, the same way she had always risen, not with noise, but with will. A new image of power to rule a nation is to hold its laws, but to last as its ruler, that requires more. It requires a story, a vision, a reason for millions of people, most of whom will never see your face, to believe in the shape of your rule. Wu Zhao understood this not as a theory, but as a necessity. She had claimed power in a world that was not built for her. And now, as emperor, she needed more than laws and soldiers. She needed meaning. She began not with threats, but with symbols. Across the empire, she commissioned new inscriptions, not in her name alone, but in the language of fate and harmony. She presented herself not merely as a ruler by right, but as one chosen by the heavens, not by birth, but by destiny. She aligned herself closely with Buddhism, sponsoring translations of sacred texts, building grand temples in the capital and in distant provinces. In these temples, images of enlightened kings, rulers of compassion and clarity, began to resemble her face. She did not claim to be divine, but she allowed others to believe that her rule was guided by more than human hands. The monks spoke of her wisdom. The scholars wrote of her calm. The people saw temples rise where none had stood before, and in their prayers, her name was spoken softly, almost reverently. Her portrait was painted in strong lines, not soft or submissive, but steady, serious, exact. She wore the robes of authority, stood with the posture of heaven's mandate. And slowly, the image of the female emperor became less of a curiosity and more of a reality. She also reformed the way her government recorded her presence. Edicts were issued in her voice. Her own name was marked with the character she had chosen, Zhao, the sun and moon under the sky. It was not just a name. It was a message that her rule was balanced, that it held light, that it stood above all division. Beyond the capital, she sent inspectors to the provinces, not to punish, but to understand. She read reports not just of grain and roads, but of the people's mood. She wanted to know how she was seen, and if she was heard. And when complaints were just, she answered. When changes were needed, she made them. In the palace, she led by ritual. Court sessions were disciplined, efficient, and respectful. She did not tolerate chaos or waste. She listened more than she spoke. But when she spoke, every word was chosen, with care. The ministers, many of whom had once doubted her, began to admire her focus. Some even feared it, not because she was cruel, but because she was precise. And perhaps most remarkable of all, she did not seek to erase her past. She did not hide the years she had spent as a concubine, as empress, as regent. She allowed them to remain, because they were not weaknesses. They were her foundation. She had risen from the shadows, and now she ruled in the light. Wu Zhao was no longer simply a woman who ruled. She was an emperor who had redefined what it meant to rule, not by becoming someone else, but by making the world accept her as she was. Trials from within. No empire remains still forever. Even in times of peace, beneath the surface of every quiet court, there are undercurrents. Doubt, envy, pride. These do not vanish with good governance. They wait, they gather, and sometimes they rise. For years after ascending the throne, Emperor Wu reigned with strength and clarity. Her policies were consistent, her reforms effective. The state was stable, but stability breeds its own kind of unrest, not among the people who were content, but among those who had long believed they were born to rule. There were men in the court, men of noble families, whose fathers and grandfathers had advised emperors since the early days of the Tang. They had served loyally, but deep within, they had never truly accepted the shape the empire had taken. To them, Wu Zhao was a ruler born of necessity, not of right. They whispered of tradition, of how the cosmic balance had been disrupted. Some believed that heaven would not allow her reign to last. Others simply wanted their power back. And so, they did not rise in open rebellion. That would have been foolish. Instead, they tested. A late report here, a silent disagreement there, carefully chosen silences, small refusals to follow through. Behind closed doors, poems were written. Subtle, veiled criticisms of a world turned upside down. At first they were ignored, but as the word spread, the meaning became clearer. These were not just verses, they were signals. Wu Zhao knew. She had built her rule on more than law. She had built it on vigilance. She read the poems. She traced the silence. She understood that not all enemies came with swords. Some came with brushstrokes, with bowed heads and hidden meanings. And so she acted, not with panic, but with method. She ordered investigations, quiet, thorough. Some of the poets were questioned. Some confessed, some vanished. Not all were punished harshly. Wu Zhao was careful. If a man had made a mistake, but showed remorse, she spared him. But those who had plotted, truly plotted, were removed, swiftly and without spectacle. Among the court, the message was clear. The emperor ruled not only by mandate, but by awareness. There were no corners she did not see, no whispers that went unheard. But even as she preserved order, she felt the weight of these trials. Power was never light, and though she bore it with calm, she understood what it cost. She began to choose her advisors more carefully. She relied more on men she had elevated, scholars and officials whose loyalty was not inherited, but earned. She rewarded honesty. She demanded clarity. She did not ask for praise. She asked for results. Yet even in success, she knew that trust was never absolute. In the deepest hours of night, in the stillness of her private chamber, she may have wondered, how many truly serve the crown? And how many only wait for it to fall? But morning would come, and she would rise again. Not shaken, but steady, because she had not come this far by doubting herself, and she would not lose it by doubting her purpose. The brothers of the court. There comes a time in every ruler's life when the weight of the crown grows heavier, not because of war, but because of silence. Years had passed since Wu Zhao first took the throne. Her reign was firm, her rule respected, but power, even when secure, does not fill the emptiness left by companionship. The emperor sat alone more often now. The court was efficient. The empire was calm. But within the quiet walls of the palace, the hours grew long. It was in this quiet that the brothers arrived. Their names were Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong, young men of modest origin, brought into the palace by chance, or perhaps by design. One was graceful, charming in speech. The other more reserved, more observant. They were not ministers. They were not generals. They held no noble titles when they arrived. But they had something else, attention. They paid it with care. And Wu Zhao, now aging, now surrounded by men who measured her in numbers and policy, found herself drawn to the way these two brothers offered something simpler, presence. They were kind. They listened. They spoke not of war or taxes, but of art, of music, of small joys. In their company, the emperor was not a ruler. She was a woman, and perhaps in that, she found a rare kind of peace. The court noticed, of course. It always noticed. Whispers began to flow through the halls again, not of rebellion or policy, but of propriety. Some said the brothers were too close. Others said they used their favor for power. Their clothes grew finer, their access more direct, and with that, the old doubts resurfaced. Could a ruler so strong be swayed by affection? But Wu Zhao was not blind. She knew how the court watched. She knew the stories they told, and yet she did not send the brothers away. Because even emperors grow weary. Even rulers grow old. And in a palace built on calculation, the presence of someone who smiled without strategy, even if only for a moment, was something she chose to keep. Still, she was careful. She gave them titles but kept real power elsewhere. She allowed their presence, but did not let them shape the empire. If others feared their influence, it was because they assumed affection meant weakness. But they did not know Wu Zhao. She had risen through storms. She had ruled through silence. She had survived when others thought she would fall. And if she chose to keep these brothers near, it was not because she had forgotten how to rule. It was because she had remembered how to feel. And in the long corridors of a life lived in command, that remembrance, brief, fragile, and deeply human, was something she guarded, even if it meant facing whispers once more. The end of a dynasty's dream. The years do not ask for permission. They arrive quietly, even in the halls of emperors. Wu Zhao had ruled longer than many had expected, longer than any woman in China's history, and longer than most men. She had built a dynasty, held an empire, and proven her strength not once, but again and again. But time is a ruler more powerful than any throne, and even she could not escape its reach. Her steps grew slower. Her voice, once steady and calm, began to fade into whispers. Though she still sat upon the throne, she did so for shorter hours, resting more often, speaking less. Her mind remained sharp, but her body reminded her, gently at first, then, more insistently, that no reign is eternal. The court watched, silently. Ministers adjusted their tone when they addressed her. Some avoided eye contact too long. Others began to look sideways at her sons, wondering which one would rise, and when. But no one spoke of succession aloud. Not yet. Not in her presence. Not while she still breathed as emperor. The brothers, Yizhi and Changzong, remained by her side. They helped her rise when the pain in her legs was too much. They read documents aloud when her eyes could not focus. To some, this was devotion. To others, it was control. But Wu Zhao, though weakened, was not unaware. She saw the glances. She felt the silence in the court deepen like a fog. She knew the end of her reign was no longer a matter of policy, but of time. She had built the Zhou dynasty with her own hands. Every decision, every appointment, every law had carried her touch. But now even she began to ask herself, what would happen when her hands no longer moved? Outside the palace, the people still spoke her name with respect. They remembered the roads she had paved, the order she had kept, the peace she had maintained. But they too began to prepare, not for revolt, not for collapse, but for change. The dream of a dynasty ruled by a woman, once impossible, then undeniable, now stood at the edge of uncertainty. And in her quietest moments, perhaps Wu Zhao allowed herself to wonder, had she done enough? Had she secured what she built? Could anyone truly protect it when she was gone? But the sun still rose, and each morning, with help, she sat upon the throne once more. Because until the end came, until the very last breath, she was still the emperor, and she would not leave the seat of power until power itself left her hands. The last sunset. Final days of an emperor are never written in fire or storm. They come like dusk, slow, soft, inevitable. For Wu Zhao, the woman who had risen from silence to rule an empire, the last chapter of her life arrived not with revolt, nor with disgrace, but with the quiet turning of time itself. Her body had weakened. Her voice, once full of calm command, now trembled. She no longer held court. Her days were spent behind curtains, attended by a few familiar faces, her presence more memory than presence. The ministers came and went, decisions made increasingly without her hand. But no one dared to call it the end. Not yet. She had once ruled through will alone, but now even her will bowed to time. The court, sensing the shift, began to prepare. Whispers returned, not of rebellion, but of restoration. The Tang name, once set aside, waited just outside the gates. Her sons, who had grown under her shadow, now stood in quiet competition, each wondering who would rise once she stepped down, or was forced to. In the year 705, the court made its move. She was old, she was tired, and for the first time, her silence was not strategy, but surrender. Her closest officials, some loyal, some merely practical, approached her chambers with a petition. It was not an act of violence, it was an act of finality. They asked her to abdicate, to let go of the throne she had held longer than any woman had ever dreamed possible. And in that moment, perhaps she saw what she had always known, that even emperors must return to earth. She did not resist. She stepped down. The Zhou dynasty, her dynasty, ended with her reign. The Tang name returned. Her son, once cast aside, now reclaimed the throne. The records were adjusted, the temples repainted. Her name, once etched into every document, was slowly replaced, but she was not erased. She lived for a short time after, no longer emperor, no longer in command, but still watched, still remembered. She wore the simple robes of retirement. She walked less, spoke little. And in those final days, perhaps she allowed herself to remember. The girl who entered the palace at 14, the years in the temple, the slow, silent rise, the crown, the price. She died not in shame, nor in glory, but in stillness. No temple bells rang for her like they once had. But in the hearts of those who had lived through her time, her name lingered, not as myth, not as legend, but as a ruler who had changed what was possible. Wu Zhao had ruled an empire. She had stood alone at the top of a world that had no place for her, and though her sun had set, the sky would never again look the same. After the throne, even after an emperor steps down, their presence never fully leaves the palace. Walls remember, voices soften, curtains move a little slower. When Wu Zhao relinquished the dragon throne, the court exhaled, not in joy, not in grief, but in relief. The weight she carried had been heavy, not just for herself, but for all who stood beneath her shadow. And now, that shadow remained, even without her on the throne. Her son, Zhongzong, was restored as emperor, taking back the Tang name and the authority that came with it. But he did not rule alone. Around him were ministers who had once served, his mother, their habits, their caution, their loyalty, all shaped by years under her eye. The Empress Dowager still lived quietly in a separate palace wing. She did not speak at court, but her name lingered in every decision, like an echo in a deep hall. Some feared her return, others hoped for it, and a few, still loyal, visited her in secret, not to plot, but to ask for advice. She had been more than a ruler. She had been the mind of an empire, and wisdom like that does not disappear with a title. Wu Zhao herself did not seek influence. She did not write edicts or send messengers. Her days were simple, walks when her body allowed, tea at her table, the turning of quiet pages. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words were precise, just as they had always been. Servants noted her calm. Her eyes still observed everything. She had lost none of her clarity, but she had changed. Where once she walked with command, now she moved with memory. Where once she planned, now she reflected. Her legacy had been written in stone, in law, in silence. And now, in her final years, She watched others carry what she had built, some carefully, some carelessly. She did not mourn the loss of power. Power had never been her only goal. Her eyes had always looked further than the throne. She had ruled to bring order. She had ruled to survive. And now, having done both, she rested, not as a woman forgotten, but as one remembered even in stillness. Outside, the city moved on. Banners flew again with the Tang name. Ceremonies honored old ancestors. Officials redressed in styles from the former dynasty. And yet, none of it erased her reign. Because history, once changed, does not return to its original shape. And Wu Zhao, even without the crown, was still the shape that history had to bend around. The mirror of legacy. There is a silence that comes only after a storm, not the silence of fear or emptiness, but the deep, echoing stillness that follows great change. After the throne, after the titles, after the names had been stripped or restored, Wu Zhao found herself living in that silence. And in it, she looked inward. Her palace rooms were smaller now, but not poor. There was warmth in the wood, light in the curtains, quiet in the air. She did not need ceremony anymore. Her robes were plain. Her meals were simple. She no longer woke to petitions or guarded whispers. She woke to birdsong, the wind, a pot of tea cooling gently beside her. But time, even in stillness, does not forget who you were. Sometimes she would sit by the polished bronze mirror, the same one she had once used to arrange her crown, and look not at her hair or her face, but at her eyes. Eyes that had seen so much. The death of children, the betrayal of sons, the cold glint of court daggers hidden behind smiles. Eyes that had watched dynasties rise and fall, and yet still open, still clear. What did she see? Not regret, not pride. She saw the cost. She saw a girl entering the palace at 14, a girl with no name, no title, only silence. She remembered the long corridors of waiting, the stone floor of the convent, the night her child was taken, the day she took the throne. She remembered everything. She did not rewrite her story in her mind. She did not make herself a saint, but neither did she think herself a villain. She had done what was needed. In a world that never opened its gates to women, she had found a way to not only enter, but to rule. And for that, she would always be remembered. Loved by some, feared by others, but remembered all the same. And that, perhaps, was enough. Time's younger attendants would ask for her thoughts. About court, about ruling, about justice. She answered sparingly. "Choose carefully who you trust," she once said, "and more carefully who you fear." She did not speak of heaven or punishment. She left no final scrolls declaring her innocence or greatness. She let the world think what it would because she knew. History was never written in one voice. It was written in layers, and her layer was already carved into the stone. One afternoon a servant brought her a scroll, a newly copied chronicle from the outer provinces. It spoke of her reign with formality, but not reverence. It called her capable, ambitious, ruthless, effective. She read it, then set it aside, and smiled, not with bitterness, but with understanding. Because in the mirror before her she saw the same truth reflected back. She had not ruled to be loved. She had ruled to survive, and in surviving, she had changed the world. The last morning, it began like any other day. A breeze passed softly through the palace window, stirring the curtains just enough to bring in the scent of the garden. Faint jasmine, a touch of morning dew. The sky, outside, was pale, almost white, the kind of light that comes just before sunrise. Wu Zhao, now far from the throne she had once commanded, opened her eyes. She did not rise immediately. Her body no longer moved with ease. Each motion was a quiet negotiation with time. But there was no pain that day, only stillness. A stillness that had settled not only in her limbs, but in her thoughts. She had lived many lives in one lifetime. She had been a servant, a concubine, a mother, a widow, an empress, an emperor, a name feared and revered alike. And now, she was simply a woman, nearing the end of her breath. The attendants moved softly. They no longer asked what she wished to eat, or whether she wished to walk. They knew. They brought tea anyway, and placed it near her bedside. She looked at it, but did not reach for it. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the open window where the early light traced faint golden lines across the stone floor. It was quiet. There were no envoys at the gate, no reports to sign, no petitions waiting with trembling hands, just the soft ticking of time and the warmth of the morning sun. She did not speak much that day. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper, more breath than sound. But those around her understood. She thanked them, not with ceremony, but with gentle eyes. At some point she asked for her writing brush. It was placed in her hand, but after a long pause, she set it down. There was nothing more to write. Her story, she knew, was complete. Some say she closed her eyes slowly, as if watching something in the distance. Others say she simply stopped breathing, so gently that no one noticed until the silence had grown too deep. No great bells rang, no army marched, no decree was made until the following day. But in that quiet room, on that quiet morning, the last breath of Wu Zhao left her body, and with it, the last living thread of a chapter that would never be repeated. She died not with thunder. She died with peace, and the world she had once ruled turned slowly into the next chapter. After the storm, when a ruler dies, the world does not stop. The wind still moves through the streets. The sun still rises. Officials still gather in the court hall, their scrolls in hand, their robes pressed, their voices calm. But beneath the high surface, beneath the ceremony, beneath the incense and the bows, there is always a question that cannot be spoken aloud. What remains? Wu Zhao had ruled as emperor. She had rewritten titles, reformed systems, reshaped a dynasty. And now, she was gone. Her name was not shouted in the streets. There were no monuments erected in her honor immediately. In fact, the court moved quickly to restore what had come before. The Tang dynasty, once paused, now resumed its place as if time had only skipped a beat. Her son ruled under the old name, the old calendar, the old rituals. Her edicts were reviewed. Some were quietly erased. Others were left intact, not out of loyalty but because they worked. Officials who had risen under her rule kept their posts. They spoke carefully. They did not mention her unless asked. And when they did, they used the titles the court approved. Not emperor, but empress dowager. Not ruler, but regent. History, even in its earliest drafts, began the work of softening her legacy. But she had left behind more than titles. She had left behind a new model of merit. She had proven that intelligence could rise above birth, that examination could matter, more than bloodline. She had built a bureaucracy that no one could fully undo without breaking the machine she had fine-tuned. And the people, the farmers, the craftsmen, the soldiers on the border, remembered her not as a controversy, but as the ruler who had brought peace. In the villages, her name was spoken in half-whispers, sometimes with awe, sometimes with confusion. A woman on the throne? Some had never believed it. Others said, yes, she ruled, and the land was quiet. In temples, the monks continued to chant prayers commissioned by her court. The statues she had built still stood, weathered by time, but unmoved. The prayers, too, endured. And in the capital, where power had once centered around her every word, there now lingered a strange quiet. The kind of silence left not by absence, but by something that still lived in memory. For years after her death, no woman dared step near true power again. Her reign had proven it was possible, but it had also proven the cost. And so, the court rebuilt its old walls, carefully, deliberately, hoping, perhaps, that the past could become stable once more. But the echo of her footsteps still lived in the stone. And in the scrolls of history, even those written by men who feared her, one truth remained impossible to erase. She had ruled, truly, completely, and nothing after her would ever be the same again. What history remembers, when a ruler dies, their story does not end. It begins again, in the hands of those who write, those who remember, and those who choose to forget. Wu Zhao, the only woman to claim the title of emperor in China's long history, left behind no final proclamation, no last speech, no carved summary of her reign. Instead, at her tomb, there stood a blank stone, tall, smooth, and silent. The people called it the unwritten stele. Some said she left it blank because no words could capture her life. Others believed she wanted history to judge her without her own voice guiding the pen. And so the silence became its own kind of story. In the official records, her name was adjusted. She was no longer Emperor Wu. She became Empress Dowager Wu. Her reign was folded back into the Tang dynasty, as if the Zhou she had founded had been a brief interruption, a footnote. But the people did not forget. In villages, stories of her intelligence, her ruthlessness, her rise from concubine to emperor were told and retold. Some saw her as a symbol of ambition, others as a warning. Children heard tales of her cleverness, her beauty, her iron will. Scholars debated her legacy. Was she a usurper, a reformer, a tyrant, a visionary? The truth, perhaps, was that she had been all of these. She had promoted talent over birthright, expanded the examination system, strengthened the state. She had also removed rivals, silenced dissent, and ruled with a firm hand. She had been a woman in a man's world, and she had not only survived, she had ruled, and that, more than any title, any edict, any war, was what history remembered. Not the details of her policies, not the names of her ministers, but the fact that she had done what no woman before her had done, and no woman after her would do for centuries. She had taken the throne, and she had held it. The unwritten stele at the foot of Liangshan, in the quiet hills of Qian County, two tombs rest side by side. One belongs to Emperor Gaozong of Tang, the other to the woman who once ruled beside him, then above him, Wu Zhao. Before their joint resting place stands a single stone. It is tall, it is smooth, and it is blank. This is the unwritten stele, across centuries of Chinese imperial history. Rulers left behind words, grand epigraphs carved into stone, filled with their triumphs, their lineage, their divine right to rule. But Wu Zhao, the only woman to take the name emperor, left behind no inscription. There is no praise, no poetry, no summary of battles or reforms, just a monolith of silence. Why? Some say she intended it that way, that after a life lived so completely, in words, edicts, judgments, proclamations, she chose to let history speak for itself. Others believe it was her successors who chose to leave it blank, unsure of how to summarize a reign so unique, so complicated, so controversial. Was she a tyrant, a reformer, a mother who punished her sons, a ruler who gave the poor a voice? The stone answers none of these. Instead, it stands quietly, as it has for over 1,000 years, letting every generation bring their own questions. Pilgrims come and touch its surface. Scholars come and measure its silence. Artists sketch it. Tourists photograph it. But the words are never written. And maybe that's the truth Wu Zhao understood best. that no single version of her could ever be final, that she would live on, not in a carved list of titles, but in debate, in memory, in contradiction. And so the stone remains, a monument not to certainty, but to complexity, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful legacy is not what is said, but what is left unsaid. A shadow in history. After Wu Zhao's time had passed, the empire continued. Dynasties rose, dynasties fell. New emperors claimed the mandate of heaven. New laws were written. New palaces were built over old stones. But the memory of one woman, the only woman to ever sit on the dragon throne, never truly faded. In the Tang court, her name was mentioned carefully, if at all. The official records referred to her with modified titles. Her reign, though undeniable, was tucked between reigns of male rulers, as if it were a bridge rather than a throne in itself. The Zhou dynasty she founded was treated not as a true dynasty, but as an interruption. Yet even when they tried to soften her place in history, they could not erase her. The Song dynasty came centuries later, more scholarly, more cautious. Historians debated her in the safety of scrolls and ink. Some labeled her a usurper, others a political genius. One official wrote that her reign had brought peace, but at a cost. Another wrote that she ruled better than most men, and that was what frightened them. But none could deny she had ruled. None could pretend she was fiction. Under the Ming, her story returned in whispers. In poetry, in theater, in painted scrolls, she appeared again, sometimes noble, sometimes cruel. The image shifted depending on who held the brush. Was she the woman who killed her rivals, or the one who opened doors for the poor? Was she a seductress or a strategist? No answer was agreed upon, and that lack of agreement became its own kind of truth. Then came the Qing, with their own ways of power, their own fears of instability. They spoke less of her. Too much talk of a woman who ruled as emperor was not useful. Yet even in silence, her shadow lingered. Girls born under the Qing were still told stories of her, not as example, but as possibility. And later, long after, the imperial age had ended when China entered a new world of republics and revolutions, her story found new voices. Scholars revisited her records. Writers found fascination in her decisions. Activists debated whether she was the beginning of something or a lonely exception. Each era painted her differently, but none dared forget. Behind the curtain, before she claimed the throne, before she changed her name, before history had to decide what to call her, Wu Zhao ruled from behind the curtain. It began quietly. A few decisions made in her husband's absence. A few petitions, answered when he was too ill to rise. Ministers thought it temporary. Courtiers said it was necessary. No one saw it for what it was, the beginning of something permanent. She sat just out of view, separated from the court by a thin veil of silk, but her presence was unmistakable. When the emperor's voice grew weak, hers remained steady. When questions were asked and silence followed, it was her answer that came. Documents were brought to her chamber. Imperial seals passed through her hands. Every corner of governance bent slowly toward her influence, and she never rushed it. She never stepped forward too quickly, never claimed what was not yet ready to be hers. She let the court convince itself. She let the people believe that stability required her guidance. And slowly, without titles, without declarations, she became the center of the court. They called her Empress Wu, but in truth, she was already emperor in all but name. Other rulers would later try this approach, to govern without openly ruling, to hold the strings from the shadows. Some succeeded, briefly. Others failed, consumed by the very silence they thought would protect them. But Wu Zhao had mastered the rhythm of power. She knew when to speak, when to wait, when to let others fall on their own. Behind the curtain, she watched everything. The faces of ministers as they turned to where they thought the emperor sat. The hesitation in their voices when they addressed her directly. The way they began to pause before disagreeing, not out of fear, but out of respect, because behind that curtain was not just a woman. Behind it was the mind of the empire. And long before the world called her emperor, she had already become one. Not by forcing the curtain aside, but by making the world forget. It was even there. The sons of the empire, in the quiet chambers of the palace, where jade screens separated mother from child, and silence often stood in place of affection. Wu Zhao raised sons not as children, but as heirs. From the moment they could walk, they were taught to bow. From the moment they could speak, they were told what could never be said. They were not just her flesh and blood. They were symbols, pieces of the dynasty. Future emperors, perhaps, but even as they grew, they remained beneath her shadow. Some tried to step out from under it. One son, bold and impatient, questioned her authority. He believed perhaps that age alone made him ready, that being a man, a prince, meant he would be handed what she had built. He learned otherwise. She removed him, not with fury, but with formality. A title stripped, a residence reassigned. No scandal, no violence, just distance. Another son played a quieter game. He gathered allies. He spoke carefully. He waited. But she was patient too. And in a world where silence can echo louder than words, she heard everything. He too was sent away, not as punishment, but as protection, or perhaps as precaution. To outsiders it seemed harsh, a mother ruling over her own children with such cold restraint. But in the court, where power mattered more than sentiment, it was understood. She had built the empire. She would not let it slip into unready hands, not even those of her sons. There was one who remained close, not because he was favored, but because he knew how to wait. He obeyed. He listened. He nodded when others spoke of loyalty, and never raised his voice. In time, he would be restored to the throne. But even he knew it was not his victory. It was her decision. Wu Zhao did not raise sons to love her. She raised them to outlive her empire. And perhaps in the quiet of night, when the weight of rule pressed against even her strongest thoughts, she wondered what they truly saw when they looked at her, a mother or a monarch, but she never asked, and they never told her. Because in a palace shaped by power, there is no space between crown and cradle, only silence. The name that remained. She had many names. As a young girl, she was Wu Zhao, a daughter of no great title. As a concubine, she was Mainyang, a name whispered, never spoken aloud in court. As empress, she bore the title of Huang Ho, consort to the emperor. And later, she became something no woman had ever been, Huang Di, emperor, not empress, but when her life ended, her name became something harder to speak. In official histories, she was recorded carefully, not always accurately, not always with her full titles. Some scribes called her Empress Dowager Wu, as if to pull her back into the role of mother. Some removed the characters for emperor entirely, letting the silence between lines carry the truth. A few dared to use the name she had chosen for herself, Wu Zetian. But even then, only in quiet scrolls, never on state stone. Because her name was not just a name. It was a reminder that a woman had once held all the power the empire could offer, that she had ruled with command, written laws, removed kings, named heirs, founded a dynasty, and worn the title of Son of Heaven, and that made her name dangerous. Even centuries later, poets referred to her obliquely. The dragon-robed woman, the ruler of twilight, she who wore the sun. Historians disagreed on how to write about her without inviting judgment. And still, her story lived. Not in temples, not in monuments, but in the space between what was said and what was left unsaid. On tablets, her name was carved, and yet in daily speech, it was rarely spoken. Because some names are not forgotten. They are remembered too well. The shape of power centuries have passed. Dynasties changed. Borders shifted. Language evolved. But somewhere in the quiet corners of history, the outline of a woman remains. Not clearly drawn, not fully named, but unmistakably present. That outline is Wu Zhao. Her name may be spoken less now. Her story may rest behind scrolls, behind glass, behind dusty pages that few touch unless searching. But her shape, the idea of her, continues to echo in places that have never known her face. It is felt in questions. Can a woman hold supreme power without apology? Can a ruler be both revered and feared, and still stand without needing? To explain, can silence build an empire more enduring than thunder? No one asks these questions with her name directly. They ask them in politics, in philosophy, in fiction. And often the answers are conflicted, because the shape she left behind does not fit neatly into categories. She was not the tragic figure who fell from grace. She was not the innocent heroine misunderstood by her time. She was not the villain crowned too long. She was a ruler, one who governed not just people, but perception. And so the shape of power, what it looks like, how it moves, who is allowed to wear it, was altered by her presence. Even if later rulers tried to return things to their natural order, they could not erase what had already happened. There had been an emperor, who was a woman. There had been laws, written by her hand. There had been a time when her voice carried the fate of all under heaven. That shape does not fade. It lingers, not in monuments, not in celebrations, but in the quiet resistance of memory, in the way people pause, still, when speaking of her, in the way some still whisper the name without finishing it. The women who came after Wu Zhao, no woman ever again took the title of emperor. The throne returned to its familiar shape. Robes for men, rituals for men, decisions made by men in halls built for men. But behind the curtains, in the side chambers, in the quiet steps of the inner palace, women still moved, and every woman who came after her, whether empress, concubine, or mother of the crown prince, carried her shadow. Whether they wanted it or not, some feared it. They whispered her name like a warning, told in stories meant to teach obedience. Do not reach too far, they said. Remember what happened when a woman ruled. Some admired it. They read what they could quietly about her reforms, her control, her ability to rise in a world not built for her. They did not say it aloud, but in their silence, there was respect, and some tried to follow. Empresses in later dynasties used their roles as regents, governing on behalf of young sons, advising weak emperors, guiding the court without claiming the title. They studied ceremony. They studied court language. They surrounded themselves with scholars and loyal attendants, not unlike the woman who had once ruled all under heaven. But none could claim what she claimed, because history, once shaken, had closed around her like a scar. And though no one erased her name, they placed it behind a veil no one dared touch again. Still, her presence lingered. In the Ming court, a strong Empress dowager controlled succession behind the scenes, and some ministers muttered, "This is like the old days." In the Qing dynasty, women of the inner court wrote letters with hidden authority, and eunuchs followed them not by command, but by memory. Even in new empires, in new centuries, when modern voices began to rise, some still returned to that old story, of the one woman who did what none had done before. And perhaps in that she lived on, not as a model, but as a mirror, a reflection of what power becomes when it wears a different face. and is still obeyed. The name forbidden. The story. Retold for many years, her name was kept behind careful pages. It appeared in official records, yes, but always surrounded by cautious words, footnotes, adjusted titles. Scribes knew her story, could not be erased, but they also knew it could not be freely told. Not yet she had ruled as emperor, and because of that, her name, Vo Tak Tien, carried a tension no scroll could resolve. But time moved forward. Dynasties ended. Printing presses replaced ink blocks. The silence of historians gave way to the questions of novelists, and slowly in the pages of fiction, her name returned. At first, she was a figure of curiosity, a woman in armor, a shadow in the palace, a name with no comparison. Writers imagined her as cunning, as tragic, as brilliant, as cruel. Some turned her into a villain, others into a misunderstood heroine. Her life became stories, dramatized, romanticized, sometimes distorted, but always remembered. Then came the stage. In opera halls, she appeared with flowing robes and sharp glances. Her voice, high and clear, declared justice or vengeance, depending on the tale. The audience watched, half in admiration, half in doubt. Was she real? Was she just myth? Was she both? Later, on screens both small and large, her image appeared again. Painted faces, bejeweled crowns. Her story adapted into dramas, into court, thrillers, into sweeping romances. Viewers debated every scene. Was she too harsh? Was she too soft? Was this really how she ruled? And still, her name stirred something. Not just memory, but discomfort, because every version of her, whether told with praise or suspicion, carried the same unspoken truth. She had done what no other woman had done, and that truth never sits quietly. Today, her name is more visible than ever. In books, in essays, in articles written by those seeking meaning in her reign. Some call her the first feminist ruler in Chinese history. Others say she was a product of survival, not of vision. But all agree on one thing: you cannot talk about women and power in Chinese history without talking about her. Even now, her story is not settled. It is retold, again and again, and every telling changes the shape of her shadow. The Mandate, revisited in the world of ancient China. No ruler held power by force alone. Their right to rule, their very place beneath the sky, depended on a single idea: the mandate of heaven, invisible, divine, absolute. If the people prospered, heaven approved. If famine came, if rebellions rose, it was heaven's warning. The ruler must change. It was not a crown passed down by blood. It was permission. And once that permission was believed to be lost, so was the throne. Every emperor claimed it. Few ever questioned its shape. Until Wu Zhao. She was not born of a direct imperial line. She had not inherited the throne. She had taken it carefully, deliberately, and against every custom that had ever defined the mandate's path. And so, when she declared herself emperor, she did not just change the court. She challenged heaven. The scholars waited. The priests whispered. The signs were read. Would heaven strike her down? Would droughts come? Would the stars shift out of place? But the rivers flowed. The harvests held. The empire stayed quiet. And in that silence, she made her move. She commissioned new scriptures, Buddhist, not Confucian, that spoke of a woman ruler predicted in divine text. She invited monks to the capital, allowed them to preach her, legitimacy not by lineage, but by fate. Some believed, some doubted, but the people obeyed. She called her new dynasty Zhou, the same name as the ancient golden age of Chinese antiquity. It was a signal. She wasn't destroying the past. She was restoring it, in her own image. And perhaps, in that image, the mandate itself changed. No longer a gift passed from father to son, but something earned, seized, held, by someone who proved they could carry it. Wu Zhao never claimed to be divine, but she let others say it for her. She never declared herself heaven's chosen, but she made sure no one could deny she ruled as if she were. And in doing so, she didn't break the mandate of heaven. She rewrote the terms. The curtain and the throne. In the palaces of imperial China, space was law. The inner palace, the harem side, was hidden behind walls and doors, behind layers of silk and silence. There, women lived. They served, they birthed heirs, they waited. Their world was one of shadows, perfume, poetry, and rules unspoken. Beyond the curtain, in the outer court, was the realm of men. Ministers, generals, edicts, maps, power between. These two worlds stood the Rem Chao, the curtain, sometimes literal, often symbolic. It was a line no woman was meant to cross. Even an empress consort, though respected, was expected to remain behind it. But Wu Zhao had never been content with where others placed her. At first, she obeyed the shape of tradition. She advised quietly, supported her husband, raised her sons. Her presence was gentle, formal, respectful. The court accepted her as an empress, a mother, a woman behind the scenes. Then slowly, she stepped closer to the curtain. When the emperor fell ill, she answered on his behalf. When ministers grew unsure, she reviewed their petitions. When justice was delayed, she spoke it herself. And by the time the emperor passed, no one could deny it. She had already walked through the curtain. She didn't tear it down. She didn't set fire to the rules. She simply stepped forward, calmly, deliberately, and sat where no woman had sat before, on the dragon throne. The court tried to adjust. Some called her regent. Others said she ruled on behalf of her sons. But each title they gave her still looked backward, and she had already stepped into something new. Even when she ruled, she often sat behind a screen during court sessions, the curtain still present, but powerless. A veil that no longer separated, only softened. Ministers bowed to a voice they could not see, but they obeyed it all the same. And after her, that space, the space between the curtain and the throne, was never the same. No other woman would cross it in the same way, but no one could pretend it had never been crossed. The face on the scrollin, the palaces she once ruled, Wu Zhao's presence was unmistakable. Her voice gave orders. Her seal shaped laws. Her footsteps echoed across polished stone. But long after her death, when her name was softened in records, and her dynasty folded away, there remained a question no historian could answer with certainty. What did she look like? Paintings from the Tang dynasty rarely showed her directly. Some artists, perhaps out of fear or reverence, left her face vague, eyes downcast, lips small, the features almost blended into the robes. Other scrolls labeled a figure as the Empress, but the posture felt generic, the image too safe to hold truth. Later dynasties tried to imagine her. In the Ming era, artists gave her sharper eyes, a commanding gaze. In Qing paintings, she was shown with elegance, not as a ruler, but as a legendary beauty. Some made her severe, some made her gentle. A few, bold enough, painted her in full emperor's robes, seated upright, staring forward. But these images rarely reached the public. There was never one face, never one image that all agreed was hers, because no one could decide who exactly they were trying to draw. Was she the girl from the temple, the mother of princes, the empress with quiet eyes, the emperor behind the curtain? Each artist chose one. Each scroll told a different truth. In some paintings, the background tells more than her face. dragons circling overhead, phoenixes folded into her robe, a faint curtain at the edge of the frame. In others, it's her absence that speaks loudest, an empty throne, a hand raised without a face. Even in calligraphy, her name was written with care, the special character she invented. For herself, Zhao, combining the sun and the moon under the sky, appeared in imperial documents during her reign, and then faded from use. It was a name that had once carried cosmic weight. But on later scrolls it disappeared, replaced by older, safer names. And yet even without a face, without a lasting portrait, her image survived. Not in lines or brush strokes, but in the way people leaned closer when her name appeared. In the silence before the storyteller says, "And then she became emperor." In the hesitation of the hand, before the brush touches the paper. The crown unworn after Wu Zhao, the crown remained. It was polished, guarded, passed from father to son, from emperor to heir. But though it sat firmly on heads chosen by tradition, there were moments, rare, brief, quiet, when someone else drew close. Not a man, not a prince, but a woman. They never called her emperor. They never let her touch the seal. But those nearby felt it, the weight she almost carried. In the Song dynasty, an empress dowager guided the throne through the reign of a boy emperor. Ministers met in her chambers. Policies passed with her quiet nod. But her name never stood alone. Always on behalf. Always for the child. In the Ming, another woman rose, sharp, disciplined, unyielding. She controlled the harem, influenced succession, arranged alliances. Some whispered her name with fear, but the throne was never offered. The crown never tilted in her direction. In the Qing dynasty, there was Cixi. She began behind the curtain, like Wu Zhao once had. She ruled through regents, then through sons, then alone. Her edicts were law. Her voice controlled the court. Her image filled palaces. For decades, she held power no one dared challenge directly. But even she, Empress Dowager Cixi, never took the title of emperor, never wore the crown, never claimed the mandate by name. Why? Because the shadow of Wu Zhao still hung over the court, a reminder of what had been done, and of how the world responded. To wear the crown as a woman was not just to rule. It was to step into a space the world had only allowed once. And once, it seemed, had been enough. They called others strong, clever, powerful behind the scenes. But they never called them emperor. They never let the title rest on their heads. And so, the crown sat, unworn, untouchable. However, for any woman who dared come too close. Not because it could not fit, but because the memory of the one who had worn it still burned too bright. The seal and the silence. Every emperor holds a seal, not a sword, not a crown, but a small carved block of jade, heavy in meaning, though light enough to lift. It is called the Ngok Tai, the imperial seal. Its mark on paper is simple, a red square, a string of characters. But that mark can change borders. It can start wars. It can make a commoner into a prince, or erase a name from the record forever. Wu Zhao held the seal. At first she used it on behalf of others, for her husband, for her sons. She signed their names, issued their orders, but her hand was steady. And over time, the seal no longer belonged to borrowed names. It belonged to her. When she became emperor, she created new titles, and with them, new seals. Her dynasty, the Zhou, had its own script, its own rhythm. Her documents bore her name, not as regent, not as dowager, but as sovereign. And yet, she never raised her voice. There were no proclamations shouted from balconies, no public ceremonies of conquest. Her authority flowed not from noise, but from rhythm. the slow, deliberate stamping of law upon scroll. Every day, ministers brought her pages, laws to approve, sentences to confirm, promotions to grant. And each day, she read. She listened. She decided. Then, in silence, she lowered the seal. And when that red square touched the paper, the world changed. Some feared it, some waited for it, but none ignored it. She knew the weight of the seal, knew that power, when spoken too often, becomes thin. So she let the seal speak for her, one mark at a time, building an empire not of shouting, but of certainty. Even after her death, some of her documents survived, kept in archives, copied by scholars, studied by those who tried to understand how a woman once ruled. They read her words, they saw her seal, and in the silence between ink and paper, they heard her. The throne with no footsteps. In most stories of emperors, the path is clear. Teachers speak their names, books list their years, children memorize their deeds. Battles won, reforms passed, temples built. Their lives are mapped, step by step, from birth to burial. But with Wu Zhao, the map is never direct. In classrooms, her name appears, sometimes briefly, often with another name beside it, Gaozong, her husband, or Zhongzong, her son. She is mentioned as the Empress Dowager, or the woman who ruled. A sentence or two. No lesson lingers long. The textbooks do not erase her, but they do not walk toward her either. They circle. In university courses, she returns. In footnotes, in discussions, in late lectures near the end of term, students debate. Was she ruthless or just efficient? Did she kill to gain power or to protect it? Did she rule like a man or like no one before her? Professors offer both sides, but never settle. In museums, she appears behind glass. A robe, a scroll, a coin stamped with her face. The placard reads, "The only woman to claim the title of emperor in Chinese history." No commentary, no judgment, just the fact, and that fact is enough to warm the stone beneath her empty throne. No emperor after her dared speak of following her steps. No empress after her dared ask for her title. The throne remained, but the path to it stayed quiet, as if the footsteps she once left still echo too loudly. As if one woman, once, had broken the pattern so deeply, no one dared walk the same way again. Not even in words. The room with two names. In the pages of history, she is rarely called the same thing twice. Some say Vor Hao, the empress, the mother, the consort who rose beyond her place. Others say Vo Tak Tien, the ruler, the sovereign, the one who claimed the throne. The first name softens her. The second sharpens her. And between those two names lies the hallway history. Walks, sometimes leaning left, sometimes right, but never fully still. One name reminds us she was once part of a man's reign. The other reminds us she created one of her own. Teachers use one name, artists another. Scrolls vary. Monuments choose carefully. But in every version, there is hesitation. Not in memory, but in tone. Not in what happened, but in how we are supposed to feel about it. And perhaps that is her final legacy. Not a dynasty that lasted. Not a throne passed on. Not a temple built in her name. But a room. A quiet, undecided room inside the memory of a nation, where her name still sits on the table, her shadow still on the wall, her voice still folded into the curtains. Some stand, outside, unsure whether to enter. Others step in, whisper her name, and walk out changed, because once, only once, the throne was not a man's. And history has never stopped turning back toward that moment, wondering, what if that room had never been closed?